Dangan Ronpa is for teenagers. The characters are school-aged, and the premise of a death game murder mystery is instantly easy to understand and gauging interest and appeal. Most telling is the instantly recognizable coloration of blood from the murders, since marketing an 18+ game to teenagers isn't very viable. Yet here I am, 25 years old and playing it again, back in the halls of the extremely exclusive Hope Speak Academy, famous for only accepting a small handful of students a year, each of them in the top of their field, far beyond the capabilities of a normal person. That is with the exception of Naegi, chosen randomly and deemed a lucky student. His luck takes a turn for the worst when he and his classmates are locked into the school and have to get away with murdering one another to escape. Dangan Ronpa has some good elements and some not so good, but the conversation in the fanbase isn't where I want it to be. Take for instance the characters. Archetypical and exaggerated, the extreme nature of the cast is often accompanied by comments of how one-note they are. However, I fully embrace the extreme nature of these characters, and I don't see any perceived one-dimensionalness as an automatic fault, because every one of these characters is designed with a strong thematic undercurrent that ties into the narrative of the entire game. This exaggeration is perhaps one of the most blatant elements of the franchise, as the striking designs are instantly recognizable. This is not only important in general character designs, but is especially important considering the game's large cast. Within the first hour of gameplay, Dangan Ronpa introduces you to the main setting of Hope Speak Academy and its 15 main characters plus Monokuma. That is a big number of characters for a cast in any medium, and I'd be hard-pressed to find many other works of fiction that dare throw so much at you at once. But it works, and the character designs are part of that reason. They are quickly associated with the talent, some of which obvious before you even hear it. The idol, the baseball ace, the gambler. Before long, you have a name like Ogami or Kirigiri attached to every line of dialogue, and a voice supplied by an A-list cast. Megumi Ogata, Yoko Hikasa, Akira Ishida, Chiwa Saito, Miyuki Sawashiro, Takehiro Sakurai, Kappei Yamaguchi. Holy fucking shit, Miyuki Sawashiro! These elements combine to make characters that are incredibly distinct, even though many of them rely on those familiar tropes or archetypes. I'd be surprised if you were to ever confuse him for any other franchise. Even Naegi is hard to forget considering how purposefully bland he is, because even though he was made to be plain, that only really implies when you look at him next to the other characters. His own big ahoge and hoodie under his uniform coat do a good job at separating him from what would otherwise be a very normal look. Celestia Luden is a gambler, so much of her skill comes from lies and bluffs. Pretty much every aspect of her character design is a lie. While I wouldn't be surprised to hear that she wears a lot of makeup or that the red eyes she likes to show off are actually the result of context, what's certain is that her elegant dress is meant to link to French and German heritage she couldn't possibly have. That and her giant hair drills that if straightened would probably be twice her height or just extensions. Maizono is another one of interest. Between her sailor uniform and some Zetai Ryoiki, her design holds elements of both cuteness and sexuality while also being a shade generic, which is exactly the point. Several times, Naegi calls her features not just perfect but doll-like. Maizono is likened to something artificial, something factory line. Cuteness and sexuality are both factors needed in a marketable idol, and Maizono is the most marketable idol in the entire world. Perfection is required, and her status is something that causes grief and anxiety when she's locked away from the crowd she wants to please. It's all deliberate, and when talking about deliberate design choices, Fujisaki comes to mind. Just take a look at how adorable Fujisaki is! Look! Look! Except he's a guy. The skirt of his uniform is pretty big, as it's hiding a secret that Monokuma threatens to reveal, tying into his complex about being weak. But he doesn't quite hit the draw a girl and call it a guy trap that, traps tend to fall into. Most of his perceived lack of toughness comes from all his little mannerisms, like his soft blushes and pure smiles. It's easy to take those and see why he's often treated as being weak, and that in turn bothers him, resulting in him seeking to change himself. Then he fucking dies. Oh yeah, not only is this video going to spoil the shit out of the game, if you come to like any of the characters, they will probably die. And of the character designs, one I can't go without mentioning is Ogami. In fact, I'd argue that her design is the most important in the series. And that's not just because she's a minor redesign away from being put in Fist of the North Star without the result looking too out of place, it's also because she looked like this. Like Fujisaki, Ogami has issues with her personal image. She is typically inflappable regarding it, but despite her stony expression, being called ogre does get to her. When she tells Naegi about her first love, she's constantly defensive about it, feeling awkward about liking a guy because of her appearance. Ultimately, her intimidating appearance combined with the machinations of Monokuma result in infighting among the other students, to the point that the only way that she can think to stop it after failing to talk to those who suspect her is to end her own life. And her design is key to this because, barring her appearance, she has pretty much no character flaws. She's aware of her lack of logical abilities and speaks infrequently during the class trials, but outside of that, her willpower, physical abilities, and moral virtues are top tier and perfect. If she didn't look like she did, then the conflict wouldn't be believable. If they'd half-assed it, it'd be hard to buy anything about her character. This is a girl who is virtually undefeated in her field, having fought adult men as big as her. If she looked like this, then you just nod your head and say, yep, anime. But they made sure her design leaves no ambiguity about whether or not she's capable of the things she's done. It also makes the actions of those who suspect her and fear her to be more believable. Ogami was assaulted by two characters who ultimately survived, but considering Ogami's appearance, as shitty as their attacks were, you can both believe that she took the hits on the chin, but also see why they didn't and get behind their reasoning despite the outside omniscient viewpoint you possess. And because she wasn't able to regain the trust of the others, she removes herself from the game, her sacrifice effectively ending the string of murders. Though there would be more conflict to come, the wake of Ogami's death led to no conflict between the survivors of the same magnitude as those before. The extreme nature of the characters doesn't stop at the character designs, however. Dangan Ronpa is ultimately a satirical take on the current culture surrounding Japanese high schools. If you've watched anime taking place in high school, one thing that comes up time and time again is entrance exams. Crime schools, long study sessions, countless tests, it's a lot of work to get into a good high school or college. And since it's in such high demand, the result is that even if you're at the top of your class, there's no guarantee you'll get into the best school. It creates this realm of exclusivity that might seem impossible to all but the best of the best, which Hope's Peak only accepts. There's no exam raising the bar of exclusivity, but that only makes it more distant to the average person like Nagi. But just because these characters seem to have their whole life planned out for them through their obscene level of skills doesn't mean that their talents don't narrow their worldviews, stagger their growth as people, or even help them with what they actually want to do with their lives. Leon is an amazing baseball player, but nothing about his design indicates that because he doesn't actually care for baseball. His friends and relatives only made him play because he was amazing at it, but he really just wants to get laid. That's why his hair has grown to the point that it wouldn't fit under a batter's helmet because he really wants to start a punk rock band to get the girl he likes. But the real irony of it is that his inability to escape baseball is his downfall. In an effort to dispose of evidence after murder by his own hand, he uses his pitching talent to bypass a locked grate. Since he's the only character who could pull off such a feat, he's cemented as a criminal he is and executed after his crime is discovered. This inability to escape talent is recurring across the killers. Owada, being a biker gang leader, has become so latched to the idea of coming off as strong that it too leads to his own act of murder and subsequent death. While Monokuma threatens to share a secret that would reveal that personal weakness, Fujisaki comes to him and reveals his own secret so easily. He came to him because he saw him as being manly and strong, but Owada sees Fujisaki's ability to so quickly reveal his secret as strength too, and his masculinity becomes challenged not just by anyone, but by this tiny, weak boy, resulting in him killing Fujisaki in a blind rage. His status as a gang leader and the burden he shouldered led to an expectation he couldn't meet, and he died for it. Similarly, Celestia is practically unable to not lie, so when she's suddenly victimized and strangely helpful during an equally strange situation, it comes as little surprise to anyone but the characters when she turns out to be the mastermind of the murders. And when it comes to the third trial being the most predictable in the game, I don't say this lightly. I personally happen to have a good mindset for mystery series. Even if I'm 90% sure of the truth, I can rarely commit myself to a conclusion even if I logically can't find many alternatives. I think this personal trait allows me to get more out of a mystery series than some others, but in this trial, unlike any of the others, I had pretty much the entire sequence of events confidently mapped out before it even began, even on my first time through. Anyway, while the characters didn't find the trial as predictable as I did, its overly elaborate nature not only fits the equally elaborate narrative she has contrived for herself, but also dooms her. More complexity creates more evidence against her. It's this trapping and reliance on talent that ultimately kickstarts the game as well. Even Mizono, who attacked Leon, did so due to her dreams as an idol. She just wants to make her fans happy, though she puts it in a cheesy way that isn't unusual as far as idols go. That's part of the marketability. But while we're on the subject of Mizono, I found the elements of her character intended to subvert audience expectations to be interesting, even though I can't say for certain whether or not they work. I know of her death going into the franchise, and knowing how writing a series with lots of character death goes, going into depth on any character without much provocation is a good sign that they're going to end up dead sooner rather than later. But a bit of effort was put in to make it seem otherwise, specifically in how they played with the trope not uncommon in detective works regarding their assistants who often possess a special ability. If Naegi is meant to be the detective character, as you spend much of the game investigating mysteries through his eyes, then Mizono, claiming to be an Esper, though really just having good deduction abilities, is meant to fit that assistant trope, making her comparable to, say, Luke from the Professor Layton games who can commune with animals. Except the part where she dies. The way this idea is played with takes another form later as it becomes clear that Nike isn't the detective character, he is the assistant to the actual detective Kirigiri. She's always ahead of the other characters in the trials while Naigi's going along at the only pace the game will allow, and Naegi does have a weird ability in the form of his luck. I've already written on the subject of luck in Dangan Ronpa in an older essay I've linked below, but to boil down how Naigi's talent works, it's largely beyond his control. Simply put, he encounters lucky events disguised as unlucky ones. His bathroom door being misaligned seems unlucky at first, but when Leon forces it open, it provides evidence that keeps Naegi from suspicion in the first trial where he was previously indicted. In pairing up Naegi and Kirigiri like this, it not only cements them as primary protagonists, but the fact that they are generally the most informed about what's going on highlights their static character arcs. They entered the series already holding onto the beliefs that take down the main antagonist, but their growth comes from helping each other. Kirigiri is smarter and is able to use her deductions to give words to the feelings Naegi can't easily express. In the first trial, Kirigiri avoids accusing the victim Mizono of her actions at first, letting Naegi break them down himself. If Mizono were accused right out of the gate, then Naegi would have jumped to the defense of his closest friend in the school in a heartbeat. This is a fact Mizono counted on. In her second free time after casually mentioning she has no boyfriend, speaking as if she were leaving the option open for Naegi, she requests that he not turn his back on her. Had her scheme succeeded, then Naegi would have been framed for Leon's murder, and Naegi would have been doing his best to defend her regardless due to his good nature. Kirigiri's goal in the first trial was to break this mindset of Naigi's, and over the rest of the game he no longer has that hesitation in accusing his classmates of being involved in the murders whether they did the deed or not. Because just about every character, Naegi and Kirigiri included, lie or hide a piece of evidence at some point. This is most important in the second to last trial in which Naegi is forced to either let himself be incriminated or sell Kirigiri out, testing their trust. Though choosing incorrectly leads to a bad ending for Kirigiri before returning you to the trial, choosing correctly has Naegi placing his trust in Kirigiri despite the lack of evidence and her distant demeanor. This is one of the 2 times in the game where you are required to get something related to the current case wrong. Unfortunately, the first time isn't handled as well. In the first case, while on the subject of how the killer got into Maizono's room, Nagi argues that she wouldn't let anyone in because she told him she wouldn't. Normally this would be fine, but it's represented with you, the player, having to choose a piece of evidence to bring forward. But if you've already done the trial or predicted that Maizono was the instigator, then the risk of being confused becomes higher. Combined with Kirigiri submitting evidence that the player didn't actually have access to is where it goes from being bad to terrible. The idea behind it is sound. Kirigiri is a detective, and detectives pulling up new evidence at a dramatic time is a trademark of the mystery genre, but being on the receiving end of it is not fun. It also folds into Nagi being more trusting of Maizono and the others at this point, so having him make a mistake like this isn't automatically a bad idea, but it should have been telegraphed better, or at least not tied to player choice. That example in the 5th trial is just done much better. At this point in the game, Kirigiri has already confided a lot of information to Nagi, and this trial is on the heels of Chapter 4, where infighting was at its peak, the bonds between the current survivors having come out of that situation stronger for it. But in requiring advancement of the game through Nagi's optimism, it leads to the final chapter where the dichotomy of the two is able to overcome their last obstacles. Kirigiri's logic and ideals give confidence to Nagi, whose optimism and honest, if sometimes foolish, trust in others in turn allows Kirigiri to trust and confide in him, supplying him with the information he needs to defeat the mastermind. While on the topic of Kirigiri, among the fanbase I've seen her get a little slack here or there, and I fully understand why, but Kirigiri is probably my favorite character in the first Dangan Ronpa game, partly because my least favorite part about her doesn't exactly have much to do with her actual character. If it were, I probably wouldn't like her, but when it comes to her character, I'm able to look past how her and her talent are used in the story, and that is for plot convenience. But where it becomes obnoxious is in instances like in Celestia's murder where she mentions the e-handbooks out of the blue. From a gameplay perspective, the writers needed them to come up at some point so that you could have the truth bullet added to your evidence so you can beat the upcoming minigame. But from a story perspective, it becomes harder to justify. Without even hearing Yamada's dying words, she's able to tell that Celestia's real name is going to be relevant, somehow. I mean, I get that she knew Hagakure wasn't the culprit and that Celestia was obviously a fake name, but she jumps to correctly assuming them to be relevant without provocation. It's just lazy writing to use Kirigiri to excuse a mistake or force something into the right place, but while it's obnoxious, it doesn't really hurt Kirigiri as an actual character. She has confidence, composure, presence, and is honestly just fucking cool. The suit-like design of her purple uniform next to her black gloves gives her a business-like vibe. Just like the studs on the back of her gloves, the orange of her tie breaks up the visual flow and keeps the colors from being too solid or monotonous. Her skirt, her boots, her single braid, she's just great. But even though she is a detective in a mystery, it doesn't stop her from slipping up. In particular, during Chapter 4, she gets pissy at Nagi for withholding information from her, contributing to the intergroup conflict. This doesn't turn out to be part of some kind of master plan. She fucked up and she admits it when the situation further deteriorates. It's moments like these where her logical mind doesn't account for the emotions involved that highlight why her partnership with Nagi is important and flesh her out as a character. The cool demeanor doesn't just come from the writing. Yoko Hikasa just nails that composure, bringing a strong hint of smugness as well.
彼女はある人物を呼び出そうとしていた。そこでこのメモを使ったんじゃないかしら。
And it's not just her, the general casting is on fucking point. Akira Ishida is great at portraying the haughty tone of the resident glasses-wearing prick.
なるほど。そうか。では結論はこういうことか?
The most interesting casting choice would have to be Monokuma. Nobuo Oyama is famous for voicing Doraemon, who's one of Japan's most recognizable anime characters and one recognizable to many generations.
のび太じゃなくてのび犬じゃない。
Even without the added context of being told to kill your friends by an iconic character from a children's show, her fun and jovial delivery contrasts the sinister topics wonderfully.
逆らう生徒は蜂の巣になったり爆発させられたり生き埋めにされたり溶かされたりエトセトラエトセトラ。
But my favorite performance from this game hands down comes from Miyuki Sawashiro. Of course.
私は超高校級の殺人鬼ことジェノサイダー。本名は二田孝ってダッセー名前だけどね。
I love her so much. She just puts so much sheer enjoyment into every line. I think it's worth noting because as a character, Genocider and Fukawa are pretty weak. The way she interacts with the other characters doesn't really change, so her hateful nature should get annoying over time, but between her own self-depreciation and that voice work, I'm able to find plenty of enjoyment in her regardless. In fact, while I'm one who normally prefers good writing to good presentation, I think that between thematic relevance and that presentation, I'm still able to enjoy most of the characters regardless of their general lack of any particular depth, with two exceptions. One of which would have to be Yamada. He's clearly not meant to be appealing, and, well, he isn't. His prideful personality and lack of intelligence aren't meant to be endearing, but he's also not really funny. About the only moment where I could even begin to care about him as a character was when he was conferring with Celestia. After she claimed she was assaulted, he had a pretty strong reaction in her defense. I mean, she was lying to manipulate him, but hey, there's a hint of a likable person somewhere in him. Cool. Also like his voice casting. Yamada has zero deductive skills, which is ironic because Kappei Yamaguchi also does the voice of both Conan Edogawa and L. Yamada doesn't fill me with hate when he comes on the screen, I just flop between indifference and annoyance. All that said, I think I got most of my thoughts on the characters out of the way, except for my least favorite, but we'll get to that, because I have some other points to cover first. With so many characters and their extreme personalities combined with the setting, the conflict is guaranteed in the class trials. Visual novels have always been in a weird place in the still growing world of video games. A game requires interactivity from the player, yet visual novels go on for long stretches with no more input than a button press to advance dialogue, if that. I personally have no issue with this. I call them games, but I internalize them as visual novels, and the ones I enjoy tend to utilize that medium. That said, Dangan Ronpa is neatly divided. The visual novel daily life portions lead to the similar deadly life portions as you investigate the murder before you go into the minigame-laden class trials. This segmented pacing creates a familiar rhythm that similarly matches the bizarre rhythmic life the characters have found themselves in. Each of these segments has its strengths, but also its weaknesses. The gameplay during the daily life is generally restricted to your standard visual novel text dumps, though there are some walk-around segments from Naigi's manlit perspective. However, there's also the reaction system. And what I presume is a way to make the dialogue segments more interactive, they require a button prompt and a dialogue selection to advance certain parts of the game, but it's incredibly clunky. I'd much rather just advance the dialogue forward at my own pace. If it does anything, it shows that Naigi is at least somewhat inquisitive, but there's nothing here gameplay-wise that couldn't have been done just by tweaking the script. Activating a reaction just triggers a line of dialogue from Naigi, and almost every instance is required to progress. Failing a prompt only kicks you out of the conversation to try again. If it's meant to make for more believable conversation, then it fails, as with instances you need to activate multiple prompts, the character is effectively repeating themselves over and over as you ask to fill in the blanks one at a time, which just makes it more apparent you're playing a game. If it's meant to keep a natural flow of conversation, then once again it fails because there's a tendency to kick you out of the conversation anyway, such as when you're given a series of reactions while talking to Kirigiri at the end of chapter 5. It does allow you to choose the order you get information in, like, once, and later on, similar information is delivered in the order you choose just by allowing you to pick who you talk to first. It doesn't happen to be a huge time waster, it's just completely pointless and annoying. Outside the reaction system, most of the character interaction is handled by the game itself, but you're also given more control during the free time segments. A certain number of times a chapter, you'll have the option to spend time with the other characters. This is mostly fine. The free times themselves are generally interesting, though it depends on the character. There are ones that foreshadow later events, like the previously mentioned Maizono one or the final one for Fujisaki. Some are just informative, like learning about Yamada's profession or hearing Celestia reference gambling series like Liar Game or Akagi. Some are funny, like seeing Kirigiri screw with Naigi's head. But the best ones are where you actually learn something meaningful about the character. For instance, Togami's title of Super High School Level Heir doesn't say much, so having Naigi learn about how he earned his position and what is expected of him while Togami simultaneously probes Naigi's commoner brain leads to some neat interactions. Most of the free times are a mix of these, but there's definitely some filler. Half of Asahina is about her love of food, but despite spending so much time on it, her last free time has nothing to do with that. In fact, her issues regarding potential romantic relations come completely out of nowhere and aren't mentioned again. In her case, she's a victim of a design decision to make sure the characters who survive to the end of the game, thus the ones you have more chance to talk to in free times, have more of those free times to discover. However, while the idea serves as a neat bit to flesh out the characters a bit more at the behest of the player, the implementation is not quite perfect. Because they are optional, they couldn't affect the story any, but frankly some of them were written as if they might have been planned to, or as if they should have. Naigi suggesting Fujisaki talk to Owada might have resulted in that murder. For an example of something that should have changed due to the actions from the free times would be Ishimaru. Over the course of the story, he becomes close to Owada, who then turns out to be a murderer, so he shuts down completely. Through his free times, you discover that he's always been friendless, so his strong, if sudden, bond with Owada becomes more reasonable. It's his first friend and he wants to hold on to that. Except by the end of the free time chain, Ishimaru says that his meeting with Naigi is a once-in-a-lifetime thing and Naigi considers them friends. So if you account for that, Ishimaru's complete and total shutdown becomes harder to accept if he considers Naigi a friend. That said, how Owada and Ishimaru became friends is left ambiguous, so it's hard to say where the differences lie. There's also the whole system of gift giving, but it's mostly just tedium. Likewise with school mode, which is the best way to go through the free times, but the school mode specific character interactions are generic and largely uninteresting. Yet about 3/4 of your time in school mode is going to be spent on them. However, the core of the gameplay lies within the class trials, which has long dialogue sections broken up by various minigames. Though the gameplay is never too difficult, the actual concept just works. The most iconic of these minigames are the non-stop debates where the dialogue from the characters loops under a time limit, and you have to use evidence bullets to break down incorrect statements. This requires you to understand what's going on logically and deduce what bullet would work best on which weak point. It's an awesome way to represent a debate in the form of a video game. You're literally shooting down arguments. Arcade shooters are already an established genre, but Dangan Ronpa recontextualizes those mechanics for a non-violent encounter. Making incorrect accusations lowers the trust the characters have in Naigi, and reaching 0 means failing the trial. Later trials also introduce white noise, or chatter, purple lines of text that block your shots, which abstracts the idea of being talked over by others while you're trying to make your own points. It's just a really cool mechanic, though I do have some gripes. In particular, even on the hardest difficulties, it takes way too long to take the kid gloves off. Easing the player into new mechanics is understandable, but the point of using shooting mechanics is because we're familiar with it. New context doesn't mean we have to relearn the basics. Most of the challenge in the non-stop debates comes in one or two forms, like any puzzle: conceptualization and execution. But what makes the debates different is that the conceptualization comes from the broader scope of the trial as a whole. You're forced to logically deduce what's happening just as Naigi is. As such, half the difficulty varies pretty heavily. If you get completely lost, you might be reduced to guessing. But even this becomes more difficult in the final trial, where they give you tons of options to choose from, making the guesswork even more tiring to go through. That said, even during the last trial it's not particularly difficult, but difficulty in visual novels is something I'm a bit on the fence on. Narrative is a big draw for visual novels, and being cut off from proceeding can be frustrating if you get invested in seeing it through. But if you're going to have gameplay, it should be engaging, which is where non-stop debates among other trial minigames only succeed to a certain degree. If I take issue with Dangan Ronpa's gameplay, it's because, at least for me, who's played it several times now, you have to make it engaging. The game has 3 difficulties: gentle, kind, and mean, which is to say, very easy, easy, and normal. Gentle is downright fucking mind-numbing. But mean is, well, the game is intended. But what ends up making it more awkward than it should be is skills. Going through the free times nets you rewards in the form of skills and skill points. You equip skills which take up your points, and this tweaks gameplay to make the minigames easier. The mod ability is nice, but you'll see so few of these skills over the course of your first playthrough, and there's no real reason to replay the trials. Even with the few skills you get over the game, the last trial isn't too hard. Honestly, I don't think skills add that much. I suppose the idea is that getting to know the character better makes them more likely to listen to you and makes it easier to tell when they're lying. But if the awkward balancing is affecting the gameplay of the trials, then I'd rather they be separated entirely. A well-written free time is enough of a reward on its own. While the non-stop debates are the core gameplay element, the bullets are borrowed in the bullet talk battles. They start out as a simple rhythm game in which you lock on to incoming speech bubbles before shooting them, capping off with defeating a final argument. Once again, it's a neat gamification of a non-violent element, with you shutting down the character who's reduced themselves to sticking their fingers in their ears and yelling to drown you out. If only stubbornness were this easy to deal with in real life. However, about halfway through the game they add the reloading mechanic, forcing you to think more wisely about your dead space and how often you're firing. This is about the only time the game becomes remotely difficult for me. Missing your timing becomes devastating because of the intrusive sound effects when you take damage, making it even harder to get back to your rhythm. Making things even more annoying is negatime, which the opponent uses to obscure the beats. To counter this, you have fever time, during which you can ignore the timing of your own inputs. However, negatime generally lasts longer than your fever time, so if fever time ends and you're still in negatime, you won't be able to get back into the rhythm since you'll be blind. In this case, you're almost guaranteed to take damage, which means you'll be more likely to be thrown off your rhythm further by intrusive sound effects, and god damn it! The result is that the best time to use fever time is when you start fucking up while under negatime, which is neat since it forces you to think a little bit about when you use it. However, where it comes back to slap you in the face a bit is where they change the last bit where you shut down the argument, where you need to choose a bullet before you fire. The timing is generous, but if you fuck up you'll have to do more bullet talk battle before you get another shot. Honestly, I find that to be the harshest penalty for failure in the game because game over really isn't too detrimental to a degree, and I'd say that's a plus. When you fail, you go back just a bit and get to retry, though it also affects your score in the end, but not by a lot, and score only affects how many mono coins you get in the first place. Anything harsher, like forcing you to replay the whole trial, would just make it way too tedious, so being forced to wait a bit before getting to advance the story is acceptable. In between minigames, you'll occasionally be prompted to submit a piece of evidence or answer a question. These are generally pretty easy aside from the time they force you to get the wrong answer, as mentioned, but they also restore health, while getting the wrong answer takes away health, which is actually kind of a shame. You're also given similar multiple choice questions during the free times, however getting them wrong doesn't actually hurt anything, you just get some more dialogue. The result of this is that I actually want to get the wrong answers just to see what happens. But during the trials, since you take damage, the same thing is de-incentivized, even though there are some joke answers that no doubt lead to some funny exchanges that most players have never seen, which is why I think it's kind of a shame. I'd be okay with not getting more health if I could see the other dialogue without any other consequence, just don't hurt me for it. The last 2 minigames are the Hangman's Gambit, which isn't much worth noting, and the closing argument, which is probably my favorite. It generally occurs at the tail end of the trial after all the twists and turns and dramatic reveals. When you've figured everything out, you then have to place panels down on a manga strip that plots out the events of the murder. The music is chill and it's generally pretty easy, and when you finish it plays out to a satisfying track that makes it feel like a reward for getting through. Overall, I think the gameplay is a welcome addition to Dangan Ronpa, but on the topic of the closing argument, I want to get into some more of Dangan Ronpa's general presentation. The sprites are already full of some strong expressions that help give these characters their personality, and I can't help but appreciate the ones you don't get to see that often either. Nagi's Panic sprite is only seen during the last 2 trials, and considering how early in the game my zone is written out, I never get tired of seeing her lose her shit. But during the closing argument, the rougher art style gives an even more distinct and unique rendition of the characters, which adds to just how satisfying it is. I also mentioned the soundtrack, but mentioning it doesn't really do it justice. Every track is memorable, and they're varied enough in use that they just don't get old. Yeah! It just doesn't quite manage to be something I listen to on its own as an album, but in context the sound helps keep the game lively and makes many scenes just that much more memorable. While I find the characters endearing and the gameplay interesting, those are all just aspects that factor into the story as a whole and the world it takes place in. Hope's Peak is a high school above all high schools, and the school life of mutual killing, the game that pits students against each other, only brings death to those who want to leave. It's intended as commentary. The world outside of high school is pretty scary no matter where you are, and high school itself is woefully unprepared to give those who graduate what they need to succeed. If you're out of school and things aren't going well, there's going to be a sense of longing for when times were simpler. That desire to leave is acted on by the culprits, but egging them on is the incentives given by Monokuma. He tantalizes them with things like their family, dreams, and money, things that they can't have if they stay in school forever. In Chapter 2, he threatens to reveal a secret, something that would damage their reputation, making that school life harder, and in threatening to do so, incentivizes them to graduate and leave. The role of the actual murders in this are twofold. One is marketability, as mentioned. The other primary reason for the murders is that it shows both intent and the strong desires of the killers. The school is not a bad place to live in. There's no want for resources, and once it's fully open, there's stuff to do. Yet in going through with a very deliberate murder, it sells just how willing these characters are to meet their goals and desires. Despite its construction by Monokuma, Dangan Ronpa is at its core a character-driven story. There is some coincidence, but by and large, everything happens with purpose. Having this world where you can't leave high school without the will to do so becomes crucial during the final chapter when it's revealed that the outside world is in fact post-apocalyptic. There is an attempt to make it ambiguous about what's outside, but even in just the context of this game alone, it's not really there. Naegi claims that Enoshima could have been lying about the outside world being destroyed, but they only believed it because Genocider Sho was able to testify and she had no reason to lie. The outside world is ruined, and the survivors have to contend with that against their desire to leave. And this brings me to Enoshima, who is easily my least favorite character in Danganronpa. In fact, to call her character is to do her a bit much credit. She is an excuse villain, one who exists to justify how this game is happening in the first place. She openly admits to having no real reasons to do what she does, and they don't even bother to give her a personality. Instead, she's so crazy that she keeps jumping between personalities because to do otherwise would reveal how little personality of her own she actually has. Her arrival legit sucks the enjoyment out of Last Trial for me until it finally moves away from her and back to the rest of the mystery. The game brings up questions about her and thankfully doesn't bother to answer them because to try and explain how a death cult started by a high school girl could end the world is just fail. And since there's nothing to her character, there's nothing about her character really that adds the thematic drive of the game except as a final boss. And honestly, while I'm not happy with her conceptually, I am able to look past it. The only way something like the school life of mutual killing would happen is through the actions of someone insane and evil. And Enoshima is insane and evil. Sure, that's all there is to it. As cheap as she is, what she allows for as a finale I still find satisfying. Faced with the choice to stay inside the safety of Hope's Peak forever and have Naegi executed or go into a highly dangerous wasteland outside, the surviving cast is faced with a choice that caps out their character arcs. After disturbing the scene of Fujisaki's murder and getting his ideals blown the fuck out in Chapter 4, Togami finally comes around to being less of a dick, justifying it however he can. Hagakure decides that relying on his less than reliable psychic predictions isn't ideal for him and chooses to move forward on his own, but it falls a bit short because he's always been pretty confident in whatever his mind came up with, prediction or no. Asahina, taking inspiration from Ogami's sacrifice, also agrees that leaving is the best choice to avoid having the deaths of the others be in vain. Kirigiri's logical mind is balanced out by Naegi's emotions when jumbled up by Enoshima. Oh yeah, and there's Genocider, who actually doesn't give a shit. But what sells the moment for me is how the gameplay is used, as you literally weaponize Hope to bring the others to your side one by one, drowning out Enoshima's bleak arguments. As you shoot the final bullet, the main theme starts playing and the corny dialogue is going, and it's so cheesy, but it still brings a hint of water to my eyes, making for a great final. No! Ah! Fuck! There's more! Fuck. As much as I'm able to enjoy the ending, its inherent cheesiness has also led to the most common complaints I hear about the game. The uses of the words hope and despair are bound to get tiring after that long climax. But while I agree to an extent that they're said to the point of being meaningless, what's focused on all too often is that it all boils down to good against evil, which is just plain incorrect. What's being missed here is that the good and evil part is entirely secondary to the real thematic undercurrent of Dangan Ronpa. At the end of the day, Hope's Peak is a school intended to send people into the workforce just like any other high school, especially in Japan. In fact, it's pretty much a national social crisis at the moment because high school is really the only time in the life of a Japanese person where they actually have a life. Beyond that is a workplace where you're expected to give your job everything you have. You don't get to have a life. Knowing that's all you have to look forward to once you leave high school and college can be crushing. High school sucks, but who hasn't wished they could make more use of their time there? Either to do better in class or spend time enjoying yourself. There's no right answer. There's no idyllic school life. But that's what Enoshima proposes, for the characters to just live their whole lives in high school forever, where they don't have to worry about anything, because what is there beyond high school to look forward to? Danganronpa satirizes that sentiment into Apocalypse. But that doesn't matter to Naegi, even though he's the least qualified one there. He doesn't just exemplify a normal average person for the sake of being relatable. He was brought to the school for his luck, and he takes advantage of the opportunity given to him, but his luck itself only keeps him alive once or twice. His logical abilities are only as good as yours, but the trait that sets him apart is his optimism. Even Kirigiri, who gives him the words to express his feelings and keep him hopeful, isn't able to take on Enoshima even though Kirigiri deduced so much of the mysteries the game has to offer on her own. That's because of her talent, a method that requires a neutral perspective, which trips her up in the end until Naegi brings her back around along with the others. As corny as it sounds, hope really is the first necessary step. And yes, it is fucking corny, just like the ending I love so much. No one ever became successful thinking that anything they did wouldn't turn out well for them. It seems basic because it is basic. But that doesn't mean its message is worthless or even only applicable to those in high school. You don't need to be 17 to feel 17, especially after coming from a school system that is just so woefully inadequate at preparing you for life beyond those walls. Taxes? How do I... Taxes? How the fuck do I change my oil? Enoshima was right. Life is despair. And no, it's not easy, but another critically overlooked part of Naigi's character would be his self-acceptance. In particular, it comes up during the free times of Fujisaki and Ogami. The former asks how he feels about not being particularly manly, while the latter asks about how he feels about being in the 99% of common society. He's not cluelessly optimistic all the time. He knows he's probably not going to be particularly tough or successful, but he's fine with living the way he can manage, a trait which the others often lack. That disparaging lack of self-acceptance is damaging to so many other characters because they're not happy with their place in life despite their massive talent. Leon has no attention span for baseball. Fujisaki wants to be strong. Owada wants to be seen as strong. Ishimaru doesn't see himself as a genius. Ogami has trouble accepting her femininity. Hagakure tends to take on his unlikely predictions, and Fukao is only remotely confident in her writing. But the other half of the cast has a reverse problem. Having gone through life so dedicated yet unhindered in their ideas so far has blinded them to other options or into feeling like they could do anything they set their mind to. Mizuna tries and fails to kill over her career. Yamada went straight for his goal of alter ego at the slightest provocation without much thought of the consequences. Celestia came to think her cheap lies were infallible. Mukuro never once doubted her sister. Asi and his energy came to a halt in the imposing school walls. Togami's certainties about human nature made him blind to Ogami's sacrifice, and Kirigiri occasionally let logic get in the way of her seeing the truth. Enoshima and Naigi each had both self-acceptance and confidence in themselves and got what they wanted, even if for Enoshima that was self-termination. Boiling down the game's conflict of hope and despair into good versus evil is just doing a disservice to the ideas the game explores. It aims to corner the teenage market and dish out hammy life lessons with a surprising level of applicability to get through that rough period, and does so with some cool gameplay ideas and some characters who are nothing if not colorful. But despite my praises, I can't easily recommend it to anyone. That's not to say I recommend it to no one, because while I've derived so much sheer enjoyment from this game, it has huge flaws that I don't ignore. The first half of the game is pretty weak thanks to those first and third cases. Gathering gifts for free times is tedious, and Enoshima does a great job at sucking the enjoyment out of the last trial. And the plot holes and inconsistencies, don't forget those! Fukao faints at the sight of blood, but doesn't have any particular reaction to Mukuro's brutal death. After discovering alter ego, the girls go and take a bath, but Genocide is there even though Togami and Fukao were nowhere near alter ego when it was discovered. Genocide recognizes the end of the world, but doesn't register Enoshima, despite having been in at least some proximity to her for the past 2 years. Wait, most of those involve Genocider. Huh. And that's excluding the elements that clash with the later franchise entries. And no, the cheap writing cropping up during the trials are not plot holes, that's just cheap, lazy writing. But just because it isn't something I'd easily recommend doesn't mean it's not meaningful to what is a rather sizable fanbase, and my hope is that this video has shed some light on part of why that's the case. If you haven't played any part of the franchise but reached the end of this video anyways, then thank you for watching. I think you know by now if it would be worth 20 or 30 hours of your time. But if you don't have quite that much time, why not join me again? To be continued in part 2.